was it just a few days ago that there was some kind of a, maybe using the word clash is the wrong word, but there was some kind of an encounter in the skies over Syria between Israeli and Turkish fighters, and they backed away from an actual confrontation.
They did.
Do you ever see an actual confrontation on the horizon, or unlikely?
I think the risk of actual conflict between Turkey and Israel over Syria is over.
Yeah.
The two countries kind of come to an agreement where there's now dialogue.
Yeah.
Ironically, I think the dialogue is being facilitated by another Turkic state, the Azerbaijanis. I think Azerbaijan to Israel is like the old Turkey, a secular kind of pro-West Turkic nation that is favorable to Israel. It's how Turkey was in the 90s. Now Turkey is very different. Azerbaijanis have excellent ties with Turks and Israelis. They want their two friends to get along. So they're deconflicting.
That's fascinating.
And I think that has allowed for a mechanism where at least there seems to be a hotline where if it looks like there's an escalation, they can talk to each other. So I think we are past the point of military confrontation, but there could always be accidents.
Yeah.
Unwanted, last minute. So hoping that we don't get there, which is why I think it's another area where President Trump can play a role. He's someone who can go to these leaders, Netanyahu and Erdogan, and tell them, look, I don't need you guys to get along because Dr. Cagaptay told me that you're not going to get along.
Right.
I don't need you guys to like each other. Again, Soner told me you're not going to like each other. But I want you to not fight and not get into trouble with each other because I have other issues.
And he clearly has influence on both of them.
He does, and he has other priorities. In foreign policy, China is a big one and other major issues. So I guess Trump could impose a détente between Turkey and Israel starting in Syria. And the détente would basically say that you don't need to love each other, but please don't fight.
You mentioned Iran a couple of times. Let's get back to the relationship between Turkey and Iran, historic relationship. And there have been incidents where it seems that Turkey is benefiting from the sanctions imposed on Iran. There's been some evasion of those sanctions through Turkey. But at the same time, Turkey clearly is not interested in Iran having greater power in the region. Talk about that dynamic.
You've said it so well. Turkey is not interested in seeing Iran as a great power. Now, that goes against if you kind of people were generalizing. They're like, aren't Turks and Iranians all Muslims? Shouldn't they get along? That's not the case. Turkey and Iran are two post-imperial nation states. They see themselves as hegemonic powers. And they both want to shape the region in their own image.
Throughout history,
which has been the case perhaps since centuries. In fact, Turks and Iranians fought the modern equivalent of a near-nuclear war in the pre-modern era. They fought from 15th to 17th centuries, 160 years of debilitating wars. So we all studied European history, and we know that the Ottomans were stopped in Vienna. They were. But one of the reasons why they failed in Vienna is because at the same time that they were fighting in the West, in Europe, they were also fighting against Safavids and Iranians in the East. And they couldn't fight two wars on far-flung frontiers, and their treasury were almost bankrupted, and the Iranians were facing the same troubles. They were also fighting in Central Asia. Mm-hmm. And they decided to agree on an agreement, come to a settlement in 1630s, where they decided to sign a peace treaty. The very fascinating thing about this peace treaty, and this is great dinner conversation trivia, is that it produced the Middle East's oldest border. The Turkish-Iranian border has not changed, excluding minor land swaps, since 1630s. What that means is that Turkey and Iran are on a power parity with each other. They avoid fighting because they realized back in 1630s that if they kept fighting, they would destroy the other side, but they would also be destroyed themselves. That's the modern equivalent of mutually assured destruction, a Cold War concept, where you don't use nuclear weapons because you also get destroyed if you use them against the other side. The takeaway is that the countries have settled on a power parity in 1630s, and they maintained it. The parity means that they don't fight directly. They fight through proxies, as they did in Syria. Turkey supported rebels. Iran backed the Assad regime. In the end, Turkey won. Right. But they also don't like to see the other side winning big. So Turkey would oppose Iran going nuclear, and Turkey would support U.S. policies that would prevent Iran's nuclearization. Turkey would not support military action. Mm-hmm. But if there was military action, it would criticize it. But behind closed doors, I guess Ankara elites would not be unhappy that Iran's wings were clipped, because Turkey doesn't want to see Iran becoming the hegemonic and dominant power at the expense of Turkish power and influence.
Finally, you've been very generous with your time.
Of course, my pleasure.
Let me just talk a little bit about the U.S.-Turkey relationship and also Turkey's role in NATO. Every now and then one hears concerns expressed in Washington about Turkey's role with the Russians, Turkey's role with Iran, and a feeling that maybe Turkey is not in line with NATO policy in general, and certainly U.S. policies in the region. Do you see the future of NATO threatened in any way by Turkey? Turkey tried to block the admission of at least one of the countries that just joined in the last couple of years in light of the Ukraine invasion by Russia. Where is Turkey vis-a-vis NATO? Where is Turkey vis-a-vis Russia?
So occasionally I'll see op-eds which will say kick Turkey out of NATO, and I will say which editor published this op-ed, because NATO takes decisions based on unanimity.
Right.
And Turkey will never vote for its own ejection from NATO. It's not possible.
Right.
Number two, how does it help U.S. to kick Turkey out of NATO? Because the argument is it's close to Russia. If you kick Turkey out of NATO, it becomes closer to Russia.
Right.
So it's a self-defeating argument. The point I'm trying to raise, I guess, is that Turkey is a swing state. It plays between Russia and U.S., and we've seen this most recently in Ukraine war. Turkey has supported Ukraine militarily, especially in the beginning phase of the war, providing drones, which helped, together with Russian planning, prevent the fall of Kiev into Russian hands. Turkey has kept its support to Ukraine alive since. But Ankara has also kept ties with Russia open economically.
Yeah.
So it's kind of given each side...
Russians come to vacation in Turkey. And
providing Russia with access to airspace and markets. And the whole policy on Russia is that if you put really harsh sanctions on the oligarchs, who won't be able to travel to the French Riviera, these oligarchs will stand up to Putin and say no to the end and want him to end the war. The oligarchs can now go to Turkish Riviera. If there, I may say, the food is better and the views are nicer. I know my French colleagues and others will object to this, but the point is that Turkey has kind of played in between U.S. and NATO in this war, and I think going forward this is going to be Turkey's policy. It doesn't make Turkey and Russia allies. Turkey and Russia disagree, starting with Ukraine and Black Sea issues, on almost everything. They agree on South Caucasus. Turkey supports Azerbaijan. Russia supports Armenia. They agree on they disagree on South Caucasus. They disagree on East Med issues. Turkey supports Turkish Cypriots. Russia is traditionally with Greeks on the Cyprus debate. They disagree in Libya, where they have fought a civil war, in Syria, where they fought a civil war, and in Sudan, where they're fighting a civil war, always on opposing sides. So they're far from being allies. Okay. And I think what Turkey is doing is it's kind of entering into its own power-sharing games with Russians, fighting with the Russians, and then agreeing to settle on tenuous power-sharing deals in Libya and Sudan and other places. For the U.S., I think the new thinking is great power competition. Thinking is America first. The U.S. should kind of tidy up its home first, and foreign policy, is not the priority. And that means the United States is going to rely increasingly on middle powers to multiply its power overseas. Turkey seems to be a suitable kind of middle power ally, especially in areas such as Africa and Eurasia, where U.S. would need to work with Turkey. So I think the best way to describe Turkey, Jason, is that it's not the Turkey of 20th century. It's shifted under Erdogan. 20th century Turkey saw its global vocation as being entirely European. Erdogan's Turkey sees its global vocation being European, Middle Eastern, and Eurasian all at the same time. And it says that sometimes I'm all these things at the same time, sometimes I'm neither. So
is Turkey an ally of the United States, or is the Turkish concept of strategic autonomy dominant?
I think Turkey is still an ally because Russia is Turkey's nemesis. Okay. Historically, this is the country that has helped destroy the Ottoman Empire single-handedly. And Turks know that if they're left alone against Russia, they get defeated. So they will never completely abandon or rupture their relationship with the United States, which makes Turkey an ally, but also a middle power ally going forward. And what makes it unique is that there are other middle powers, India and South Africa and Brazil. But Turkey is the only middle power that's also a NATO ally. So it makes it a consequential middle power because NATO is a big alliance. It's based on unanimity. So it's a very tricky country to manage, which is why I think the U.S. government puts a great amount of effort to understanding Turkey and also sends always its best diplomats to Turkey.
Senator, thank you very much for this enlightening conversation. And until next time, thank you for joining us for AJC Perspectives.